Before we talk about the Bantu migration, we have to ask ourselves, who were the Bantu civilization? They were agriculturalists who spoke various dialects of the Bantu language. Their heartland was the savanna and rainforest regions around the Niger River of southern West Africa, modern Nigeria, Cameroon and Gabon. Using both stone and iron tools, they successfully grew crops such as millet, sorghum, dry rice, beans, oil palms and melons. Although they did so at a subsistence level, that is, they grew only sufficient crops to meet their own needs. They had the technology to create iron from iron ore, but where this came from is not known except that the three most likely possibles are: the knowledge was introduced by the Phoenicians in the north, the Egyptians or Kushites in the east, or it was acquired locally and independently. During the second millennium BCE, small population groups of Bantu began to migrate into Central Africa and then across to the Great Lakes region of East Africa. This movement can be traced by the study of a technique known as lexicostatistics and observation of the relative closeness of local languages to each other and the language originally spoken by the Bantu people of the Niger River Delta. Proto-Bantu. The Proto-Bantu speaking settlers displaced, eliminated or absorbed pre-existing any hunter-gatherer and pastoralist groups that they encountered. But of course, a great number of languages which are spoken across sub-equatorial Africa are remarkably similar to each other, which suggested the common cultural origin of their original speakers. Historians believe that the cause of the Bantu expansion was a result of the Bantu people who founded the coastal settlements of East Africa. With the addition of Muslim traders from Arabia and Persia from the 7th century CE, which became the Swahili coast. From southern West Africa, the West Bantu, and the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, the East Bantu. Two streams of Bantu peoples then moved further south in a second wave of migration, which occurred during the first millennium BCE. A third wave of migration in the first half of the first millennium CE then took place as the East Bantu peoples moved even further south into what is today Zimbabwe, Botswana, Mozambique, and eastern South Africa. The expansion reached South Africa, probably as early as AD 300. Bantuists believe that the Bantu expansion most probably began on the highlands between Cameroon and Nigeria. The 60,000 kilometers Mambilla region contained remnants of the Bantu who stayed home as the bulk of Bantu speakers moved away from the region. The majority of the groups of the Bamenda Highlands, somewhat south and contiguous with the Mambilla region, have an ancient history of descent from the north in the direction of the Mambilla region. Initially, archaeologists believed that they could find archaeological similarities in the region's ancient cultures that the Bantu speakers were held to have traversed. They believed that the expansion was caused by the development of agriculture, the making of ceramics, and the use of iron, which permitted new ecological zones to be exploited. In 1966, Roland Oliver published an article presenting these correlations as a reasonable hypothesis, definitively traced starting from their origins in the region Central Africa, Congo. Two main scenarios of the Bantu expansion were hypothesized: an early expansion to Central Africa and a single origin of the dispersal radiating from there, an early separation into an eastward and a southward wave of dispersal, with one wave moving across the Congo Basin toward East Africa, and another moving south along the African coast and the Congo River system toward Angola. Genetic analysis shows a significant clustered variation of genetic traits among Bantu language speakers by region, suggesting admixture from prior local populations. Bantu speakers of South Africa, Exosa venda, showed substantial levels of the SAK and Western African Bantu AACs and low levels of the East African Bantu AAC. The latter is also present in Bantu speakers from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. The Bantu shared their knowledge of iron smelting, pottery making, and their farming skills with indigenous forager and nomadic tribes they met, many of whom eventually then settled into stable village communities. Bantu dialects and aspects of Bantu culture were adopted, although the migrants, it is important to note, also learnt from the indigenous peoples, especially in areas like the cultivation of some grain crops or fishing techniques which had been perfected over centuries to get the best from the specific local environmental conditions. In addition, many cultural practices, the use of stone and obsidian tools, to give but one example, often continued to be used in parallel with the Bantu people's superior technologies. As the peoples the Bantu came across were still in the Stone Age in terms of weapons and technology, the iron-weaponed migrants with their specialized warrior caste had little trouble imposing themselves wherever they went. Their superior technology also encouraged local peoples to accept Bantu's leadership. The Bantu expansion pushed out or assimilated the hunter-forager Proto-Khoisan, who had formerly inhabited southern Africa. In eastern and southern Africa, Bantu speakers may have adopted livestock husbandry from other unrelated Cushitic and Nilotic-speaking people they encountered. Herding practices reached the far south, several centuries before Bantu-speaking migrants did. Generally, the movements of Bantu language-speaking peoples from the Cameroon-Nigeria border region throughout much of sub-Saharan Africa radically reshaped the genetic structure of the continent and led to extensive admixture between migrants and local populations. Based on dental evidence, Irish, 2016, concluded that the common ancestors of West African and Proto-Bantu peoples may have originated in the western region of the Sahara amid the Kiphian period at Gobero and may have migrated southward from the Sahara into various parts of West Africa. For example, Benin, Cameroon, Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, as a result of desertification of the Green Sahara in 7000 BC. From Nigeria and Cameroon, agricultural Proto-Bantu peoples began to migrate, and amid migration diverged into East Bantu peoples, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo, and West Bantu peoples, for example, Congo, Gabon, between 2500 BC and 1200 BC. Linguistic, archaeological and genetic evidence indicates that during the course of the Bantu expansion, independent waves of migration of Western African and East African Bantu speakers into Southern Africa occurred. Where Bantu was adopted via language shift of existing populations, prior African languages were spoken, probably from African language families that are now lost, except as substrate influences of local Bantu languages. From 3000 BC to AD 500, it seems likely that the expansion of the Bantu-speaking people from their core region in West Africa began around 4000–3500 BC. Although early models posited that the early speakers were both iron-using and agricultural, definitive archaeological evidence that they used iron does not appear until as late as 400 BC, though they were agricultural. The western branch, not necessarily linguistically distinct according to Christopher Ehret, followed the coast and the major rivers of the Congo system southward, reaching central Angola by around 500 BC. It is clear that there were human populations in the region at the time of the expansion, and pygmies are their closest living relatives. However, Midna genetic research from Cabinda suggests that only haplogroups that originated in West Africa are found there today. And the distinctive L0 of the pre-Bantu population is missing, suggesting that there was a complete population replacement. In South Africa, however, a more complex intermixing could have taken place. Further east, Bantu-speaking communities had reached the Great Central African Rainforest, and by 500 BC, pioneering groups had emerged into the savannas to the south, in what are now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, and Zambia. Another stream of migration, having moved east by 3,000 years ago, 1000 BC, was creating a major new population centre near the Great Lakes of East Africa, where a rich environment supported a dense population. The Uru culture dominated the Great Lakes region between 650 BC and 550 BC. It was one of Africa's oldest iron smelting centres, and by the 1st century BC, Bantu-speaking communities in the Great Lakes region developed iron forging techniques that enabled them to produce carbon steel. Movements by small groups to the southeast from the Great Lakes region were more rapid, with initial settlements widely dispersed near the coast and near rivers, due to comparatively difficult farming conditions in areas farther from water. Between 300 AD 1000 AD, through participation in the long-existing Indian Ocean trade route, these communities established links with Arabian and Indian traders, leading to the development of the Swahili culture, Rwandan genocide and the Congo War. And of the 30,000 pygmies in Rwanda, an estimated 10,000 were killed and another 10,000 were displaced. They have been described as forgotten victims of the genocide. Unfortunately, systematic rape of pygmy women, an act of genocide by Bantu men, was widespread, according to reports by the NGO Observatoire Congolais des Droits de l'Homme, OCDH. According to the report, significant numbers of indigenous women were the victims of rape by Bantu men. As an example, it cited the village of Ngua-Tu, some 200 kilometers outside of Dolisi, capital of the southern department of Niari, where on average, a Bantu man raped one indigenous woman each week. Human rights activists made demands for these actions to be recognized as genocide. In the 1920s, relatively liberal South Africans, missionaries, and the native African intelligentsia began to use the term Bantu in preference to native. After World War II, the National Party governments adopted that usage officially, while the growing African nationalist movement and its liberal allies turned to the term African instead, so that Bantu became identified with the policies of apartheid. By the 1970s, this so discredited Bantu as an ethnic racial designation that the apartheid government switched to the term black in its official racial categorizations, restricting it to Bantu-speaking Africans at about the same time that the Black consciousness movement, led by Steve Biko and others, were defining black to mean all non-European South Africans, Bantus, Khoisan, Coloureds and Indians. In modern South Africa, the word's connection to apartheid has become so discredited that it is only used in its original linguistic meaning. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to our channel for more contents. Well, until next time.